Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to have you, Melissa, again on our podcast channel. I think many of you listening to the Garden and the Moon podcast channels are very familiar with Melissa because we've had several conversations over the past few years, and it was really interesting to get, like your perspectives on many different topics, actually, whether it's connected to the body or to the energies, of our time, the energies, like in the star system, but also like anything from beauty and health and hope. I mean, all kind of relevant topics for our world today. So as you know, I was in India recently, and for the first time I went to the north of India near Dehradun, actually, which is like really at the foothills of the Himalayas. And there I encountered the gift of Tibetan medicine. And it was a beautiful center, and this center had been blessed by the Holiness, the Dalai Lama, 10 years ago. And Melissa, anytime I would step into that center, or I would, like look at, the pictures, or I would see, like Buddha or Quan, or I would, of course, think of you. I would think of you
Well, thank
deeply
you.
because for the people who don't know this about you, I mean, I'm sure they do by now, but like you are deeply connected to His Holiness as well. And Kuan Yin is your companion on this earth, right? And I think like all your channeling are so profound in how they are the voice of Kuan Yin as well. So thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing that wisdom with us. So before we start, I would going into the depth of the topic. Could you explain for us the link you have with the Dalai Lama and Kuan Yin, and who is Kuan Yin in relatedness with the Dalai Lama?
Wow. I mean, this is a topic that is a very big topic, and I could go on for probably longer time than we have. But first of all, thank you for having me and inviting me today. I appreciate talking to you always. And before this recording, we were having a lot of conversations about India and our connection through the flowers and the connectedness of the collective energy and, of course, the big changes that are happening collectively to humanity on all the systems on Earth. It seems like we're in a very tumultuous time. So I have been awake, what I call awakened up to another bigger reality, more spiritual, my spiritual path for about 40 some odd years now. And when I first woke up, as you know, I woke up through connection with star beings, with, what were called aliens or visitors from another place. And it was a massive awakening. It took place for me in, let's see, when was that? That was in, 1987, I think there was something called the harmonic convergence. And in the early 1980s, I had a lot of going on inside me, a lot of searching. I went back to the spiritual path that I was raised in, which was Catholicism. Just a quick background. My parents were Catholic. I was baptized in Catholicism. They weren't strong practitioners of it themselves, but they made sure we knew our prayers. We went to church and we went to Catholic school. So I went to Catholic, elementary school. I went to Catholic high school. I went to Catholic college for a two-year college before I went on to complete my master's and finish up a 4-year college degree. So that was my sort of framework for spirituality, Catholicism. And here I am in the early 80s, sort of struggling in life, like what's going on. I felt lots of changes, dreams, things like that. And I didn't know what to do, but I just felt I needed to go back to spirit somehow. So I went to Bible studies, actually a Lutheran Bible study for about 2 years. I got involved in my local Catholic churches, and I had moved away from that in the 60s, to formal, too constricted, too many people not fitting in, and I was feeling this need to embrace all people, So that is a little quick background. So in the searching aspect, going back to prayer, going back to a study of some spirituality started to anchor me. If I look at it backwards, I think it was anchoring me. At the same time, I was having my first experiences with acupuncture, which I believe was opening up my system to be able to handle more energy. So you fast forward to 1987, I have this mystical journey. I feel strong enough in myself to maybe start looking at some new age things. I was never looking at those things, studying the Bible and trying to find my spiritual path that way. But I felt connected enough to embrace a shamanic journey. And during that journey, it's when I had an incredible opening. I mean, I saw the universe from space, I saw the earth from space. I knew I wasn't on the earth. And then I was like, wait a minute, I'm on the earth. It was just very like turning your world upside down, inside out, and it was very mystical. It was very magical. And, after the shamanic workshop later on, the leaders were talking, we were outside and we were looking at the sky, and there was all this lights going in patterns, and turned out they were talking about space beings. And I remember thinking, space beings, and I thought back to my journey during the shamanic retreat that we had. And by the way, there was no hallucinogenics or anything like that. And I had an amazing hours of like being in a movie and, like I said, seeing the earth and stuff. And so then after that, I started opening more to this idea that earth was in a process of change. It was coming up, and it wasn't doom and gloom that I originally thought, which sent me back to church, we're at the end of the world or whatever. It was more like there are other systems in the galaxy out there that are looking at the earth. They're not going to allow it to be destroyed. There's a movement. So I was just like kind of high all the time. And, it started to develop my clairvoyant abilities. I started working with it more. And then there was a certain point of 3 or 4 years of working in this way of recognizing that the universe was connected to everything and I was connected to another place and all that, that I realized I needed more of a spiritual teacher or a path. And so I meditated on it a lot, and I was doing a lot of work on it. And my channeling said, you will meet a teacher for you, and that teacher will be from India or in India. That teacher will be in India, and that teacher will be feminine. And I was like, okay. So I started looking up every Indian guru, like Arita Mandinai, Mamaji, Guru Mai, Mother Mira. I went to Germany to see Mother Mira. I went to see Arita Mandinai. At that point, you couldn't see Guru Mai because she was kind of closed down, but I read all about her and connected, and it was like, no. I mean, I had interesting experiences with each one, but each one wasn't my teacher. And, I finally started kind of giving up. And at the same time, I had moved from, I woke up in New York and I moved from there to New Hampshire, and a lot of this work went on in New Hampshire, my first waking up and getting balanced. And one interesting thought about that is New Hampshire is a state that is on granite. It's called the Granite State. And it was a really great place to ground when the energy was expanding and I was waking up. So I kind of realized the whole path, there was a method to every place that I went to. So I was in New Hampshire about 9 or 10 years on this path, during most of it, trying to find my teacher. And the next place I was sent to, like it would come in instinctually and things would point to it, was Charlottesville, Virginia. So I went to Charlottesville, Virginia. And at that point, I met Quan Yin. So I had a healing room, and there was an entity in the healing room, and just would be standing there, and I would see her, and I had no idea who she was. And in the long and the short of it, somebody connected to me that I had known in New Hampshire, and she said, she was selling, her husband had passed away. They had a small antique shop, very country American antiques. And I'd drawn to it, and I stopped in one day, and, there was all the nice wooden, kind of antiques. And then there was this case full of crystals, and that's what drew me to this little shop. And I went to it, and the gentleman said he had been in either the Korean War, I think the Korean War, he'd been in Asia in the military during some of the wars, and he had been drawn to these crystals, and he had collected all these carvings. And there were, carvings of, amethyst elephants, which I bought 2 elephants, and because I was very kind of drawn to them, and brought them home. And there was all these other Buddhas and things, and, I would have bought all of them if I could have. And, I moved on. And anyway, I had just moved to Charlottesville. This is maybe 4 or 5 years after I had gone into that shop. And I get a letter in the mail that was forwarded to me from New Hampshire. And the woman said, my husband passed away. I have all these carved, Asian things. I don't know what to do with them. I remember that you had purchased some and you liked them. And I wrote her back immediately because I tuned in. I said, should I buy something? And I was kind of very flat broke at that time from the move and everything. And it said, yes, ask her if there's an amethyst Buddha. And I said, do you have an amethyst Buddha? And she said, yes. And I said, how much is it? And she said, $225. And that is the exact amount that I had in my checking account. I had made the move, and I had $225 left, and I didn't have a savings account. And I was like, and I heard under the check, she was in Florida, So I'd been feeling this presence in my healing room. I get this box from Florida 3 or 4 weeks after I moved in. I open it up, and there is not a Buddha in it. It's a big, long box, and it's a standing Quan Yin. But I remember looking at it and going, this isn't a Buddha, who is this? But it was just very powerful. And I picked it up on the bottom. It said, Buddhist Goddess of Compassion. And I looked up her image, and it was Kuan Yin. And so that's how Kuan Yin came in my life. And she became one of the main entities that I channeled. Prior to that, I was channeling Saint Germain a lot, and some beings from Ashtar Command, and some of the space beings that were coming around waking people up in the late 70s, early 80s. And so that I worked with her for quite a while. I found out, that she was this Chinese goddess, and her father had, she was a princess, Mao Chung, in one of her past lives before she became the compassionate goddess. And her father poked out her eyes and cut off her arms. A lot of, the story is quite amazing. And, she just kept showing up everywhere. And, I would channel for someone, and I would, see her riding on an elephant, and it would turn out she is seen riding on an elephant. So, I would get these confirmations. So I began to work a lot with Kuan Yin. We had, the water blessings, the flower blessings, beautiful things coming in. Very, very sweet. I had, given up searching for my worldly teacher at that point. And I had a point where I was working in New York and bringing through energy for someone, doing energy work. And when I finished, I left the room, and I was looking through a metaphysical magazine, newspaper that was big in New York. And I was looking at it because I kept hearing your teachers in this, in this bundle of papers I picked up, And so I'm going through it, and nothing. And I opened the main page, and there's a picture of the Dalai Lama, who, when I was looking for my teacher, I did have a vision and earlier, but they didn't give me a name. I was just sort of standing in front of them in the vision and waiting. And it was a simple kind of a monk sitting cross-legged, and there was a curtain behind him that was very specific and a gong on this thing. And so I thought he was going to gong and the curtain would open and I would meet my teacher, and nothing happened. So I'm kind of standing there on the other planes, and I finally just gave a big speech about meeting my teacher. The little guy looked at me, pointed, and laughed. And I remember feeling so embarrassed. So that happened, and I was like, I guess I'm not going to meet my teacher today. I'll wait. So a few weeks later, I was doing the work in New York, and there was the picture of His Holiness. And I was like, that's the guy that laughed at me. And then I was like, wait, it said Free Tibet underneath it. It was a big full-page spread. And I was like, wait a minute, he's not a female. He's not Indian, he's Tibetan, or, he's not in. I didn't know anything about Tibet. I didn't know anything about the Tibet thing. Just thinking I'm looking at this little Asian guy and blah, blah, blah. So I had given up work for a while, every once in a while in the path. I was just like, why am I doing this? I should get a real job, whatever. And I did get a real job for a while, and then it was like I got this message from Quan, you need to go and do a workshop. So in the meantime, I'd been taking teachings from the Dalai Lama, traveling to different places where he did teachings, where he did a Kali chakra, lots of things. So I had a lot of experience with him. I'm also channeling Quan Yin. And I learned from that magazine thing. I remember calling my friend and saying, the Dalai Lama is my teacher. And she said, he's a very feminine energy and he laughs all the time. And of course, that triggered being laughed at. And he's in India because he's in exile. I didn't know anything about exile. I didn't know that in 1957, China invaded Tibet, and he had been in exile ever since 1957, in Dharamsala, India. So, long story short, sorry for the long story, but I think it's important.
It's fascinating.
Well, he's a simple Buddhist monk who's the leader of Tibetan Buddhism, and he's in exile in as you know, in Dharamsala. And so many teachings, people know him all over the world as a figure who, espouses peace and who calls himself a simple Buddhist monk. And he's so much more than that, yet that is his identity that anchors him to doing his work in the world. The simplicity of it, not getting caught up in, I speak to thousands of people and I can take people through a Kali chakra, and 10,000, 20,000 people can be in that room and they have experiences and visuals, and they're not doing it with tools. They're doing it with the presence of this being who's able to bring through this compassionate present. So anyway, my friend said, he's feminine. I'm like, okay, this is my teacher. I'm just going to live with it. He's got a feminine presence. A couple of years went on, like I'm taking teachings, I'm channeling Quan Yin, gave up, working for a while, thinking I should get another job. And I remember hearing at one point in a meditation, you need to do a workshop. And I set up a workshop. I think it was it was in New Hampshire, in Thousand Oaks in New Hampshire, a workshop center. And I set up for a center that summer, and a couple of months in advance. And long and the short of it is, the night before, as often with a workshop or a teaching, I am downloading. I can't sleep. I'm up, and so my mind will get, you have to sleep. You have it. And I'll be like, no, just go find a book. So I went to my library and I kind of reached up, and this book fell on my head. And it was I don't remember the name of the book, but it was a book that was 2 or 3 pages on all these spiritual teachers in the world, on Nelson, Desmond Tutu, and Mother Peace, I think, was in it. I can't remember her name, and Mother Teresa. And this was a story about many, many Indian gurus, whatever, in it. And I had bought it, and it was kind of, I read the first one, I was like, this is boring. So I never looked at the book again until it fell out this night. And I said, I just need to read something inspiring. And I opened the book, and it was on the Dalai Lama. It's like the 3 pages on the Dalai Lama. And the first few lines said that the Dalai Lama is, it's a position, like a head of this Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism. And, he's the spiritual and was the temporal leader of Tibet when Tibet was independent. And it goes on to say he's a reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara, and actually it started with Chenrezig, and Chenrezig was being born from the tear of the eye of the Buddha, the compassionate aspect, the compassionate one. And Chenrezig is sort of sometimes considered male, sometimes considered female. I don't have the dates of when Chenrezig was, out there, and I might be saying it slightly wrong, Chenrezig. And then after Chenrezig comes Avalokiteshvara, who is the embodiment, the Dalai Lama is the embodiment of that compassionate energy. And it goes on to say, it talks about the history of how it came into Japan and to China, and then from Avalokiteshvara, it's Quan Yin, and all of a sudden they were the same being to me. I began to recognize that, it was an embodiment of this divine feminine compassion, that time for it to be in the world and spreading. To go back to the Dalai Lama as an individual body and being who's in Dharamsala, India, and who did many, many teachings all over Europe, the United States. He did these amazing ritual energy things called the Kali chakras. He's done many of them. I couldn't give you the number, but I've been to 3 myself, one in Canada, one in Austria, and one in Washington, D.C. So, that's amazing. Sometimes a Dalai Lama will do one in a lifetime, and he has done many. He has brought thousands of people, and thousands of people daily go to Dharamsala to have, to be in his presence, to be in the temple there. So there's this aspect of him that is the container for the divine energy of Quan Yin, Avalokiteshvara, Chenrezig, the bringer of compassion into the world. And it's certainly time for compassion. Our world is, moving from the I, the me, the, no pain, no gain, money is everything, into a spiritual evolution. And this is what I was told 40 years ago, that because when I first woke up, it was the doom and gloom aspect. The world is ending. We're going to have a polar shift, which we look at our ecology right now, and the melting of the polar ice caps and something, and you could see how that could happen. What my channeling said is the shift is not going to be like a physical giant flip like it was during the Ice Age. The shift is going to be from the polarization of consumerism, to gaining, need, stuff, to spirituality. So the polar shift happens inside each individual. So that's a little bit about, how I began to connect with the energy that the Dalai Lama is connected to, that he is bringing into the world, this compassion. And yet his identity, that he says, the identity of a simple Buddhist monk, when we know that he can change the world with his energy. I was in Central Park when there was, some books say there was 20,000 people, some people say there was 40,000, whatever the amount there, that the crowd was kind of like grumpy. It was a hot day, and I think it was in August or something, and we were out in Central Park, and it was crowded, and people were like, and all of a sudden he came on stage and people melted, and at the end of that talk, it clicked in my head. I see how we can change from, materialism to spiritualism. I saw a crowd of people go from being grumpy and complaining and, getting too close and restless, to just melting. And, we listened to him, he did his talk, and people just floated out into the city of New York, bringing that energy. To me, it's like the flower and pollen. He's like his light goes out, the particle of the divine compassion comes through, and it just sort of spreads out the way pollen does, the way the energy does. And each person that has him in his heart after a meeting carries that onward. So he is able to conduct that. And I think part of the reason is because intellectually, the way we're discussing spirituality and energy right now, intellectually, he says, I'm a simple Buddhist monk. So he identifies with the renunciation of the monk, with the renunciation of, with his path, with his practice. And one thing I have learned, especially with the expansiveness of opening, third eye opening and opening up to information from the universe, is I need a spiritual practice to keep myself anchored in what my purpose is in connecting to all this. So, when I
I
first,
love that.
yeah.
I love that. I think it's so critical. So how do you do that, Melissa? How do you keep yourself grounded in your life purpose through a spiritual practice?
So the spiritual practice at the end of the day is the thing that keeps you anchored in this reality in this moment. In the reality in this moment, whatever energy I can bring through, whatever connection I feel when I bring through that energy, which I do feel connected to the all one. I would imagine on some level that to a much greater degree, that's what the Dalai Lama is able to do. So I know that I can sort of do a channeling and watch a crowd of people, 20,000, because I've never been in front of them, but calm down or go into, and everybody is feeling good after, or crying, or, like an energy comes through, it's a healing energy. So, that could make me think, ooh, I'm special, or, oh, I'm weird, or, it's brought a lot of things up over the years. And I found I need an anchor in something that is about this time of being in this body. And the Dalai Lama always says, very simply, be a better human being. How can I be a better human being? So the practices that help me be a better human being, calm my mind, for me, it's been Buddhism, the tenets and the teachings of Buddhism that allow me to understand the mind, and how the mind is, the greatest problem causer, like what we're thinking and how to get clear in the moment. And so there are many things that come through in channeling, and one of them is being in nature, which I know is one of the most important parts of your practice. Every single full moon channeling that I do, and so for the last 20 years, I do a channeling every single full moon, a group channeling, and that the public can hear or come and see or whatever. And it's always, especially in the last 5 years or so, like when people say, how do I stay grounded with all this intense energy that's coming in, that's opening people up, and then intense energy that's coming in is stirring up the things that don't work, that are not of love and compassion. So we're having a lot of breakdowns in the systems that have become about materialism, that become about ego, that have become confused, whatever. And so we are seeing all this wars, craziness, governments, rattlings, institutions, money, everything changing. How do I stay centered? And the channeling always says, go to the earth, put your phones down, get away from technology for a bit, go lay on the earth, go hike, go be with it. And then I take the practice of mindful and conscious breathing. So being mindful of watching my thoughts, and noticing that when I get myself caught up in a conspiracy theory or a worry or a fear or a he said, she said, kind of energy where I'm in duality, I'm not at peace. I'm not comfortable. So I think the simplest thing is the practice that brings you to that center, to that peace, to that identity of being a better human being. And that's why I love His Holiness, because you can get into Buddhism and intellectually it's very intense, doing all the studies and the readings, and I've done more and more over the years. And you can get caught in the intellect with it. So here is someone who is very highly trained in Buddhism. He's at the level of, a doctorate level, I guess, if you were to look at his training in European or English way, American way. So he's a very highly smart, trained, flashes of inspiration. He's also able to do those rituals that change a whole group of people. So he's all these facets, but the one he identifies with is the simple Buddhist monk that's here to be loving, compassionate, clear in himself, and to move into enlightenment through the practice. Does that make any sense at all?
Yes, I mean, how profound, how profound. And I really love that word also, compassion. I think, like we hear it a lot, and I think the more you go, like, look deeply at it, like the more it unfolds. And I was wondering, Melissa, how would you describe compassion for yourself, like, for, since everything is a little bit of a mirror of how you look at yourself, and therefore you look at the earth. And I know, like, in my own life, like, I often question myself, or like, because I try to understand the other so much, and I see why and where I may have, maybe, like, not quite met them where they were. And then I feel like, I wish I could have seen that. And I feel like I'm judging myself because of that. And so I feel, like, the compassion also happens first and foremost for ourselves. And it's the most difficult part, isn't it?
Yeah, I think this is a really deep discussion and very interesting question. If we were to just sort of formalize it for a bit, we'd say that I think compassion is awakened in the system in layers. To get to be someone like the Dalai Lama that took lifetimes, and he's supposedly the 14th reincarnation of all these high Buddhist lamas, Dalai Lama, and he says he's the final one, but that's another whole story. So I think first, think sympathy. We're caught up in our own world. We're caught up about ourselves and survival, getting enough attention from mom and dad, getting food, because we're helpless. So the first few years of a human being, they're very helpless. They're not going to live on their own. A baby goat is up in 2 hours, scampering around, knows how to go to get milk from the mom and start to eat grass and stuff like that. But a baby human takes a number of years before it can even walk and talk and develop the brain and how to take care of the self. So so layers. And I think, so the me first is there. The survival instinct is there when you're born. And then there's that layer of sympathy that maybe crops up when you see somebody else that doesn't have toys, or is, picture of a starving child when you're living in Europe or America or whatever. And then from the sympathy, I think empathy. There's then a certain point where you can, when you feel sympathy for someone's condition, you can start to empathize with it because you have a condition of not being loved or whatever it is in yourself. And then from the empathy, I think that you go to compassion, which is a detached compassion. It's not when you get into the story or you get pulled into the feeling so deeply that you're lost in your own depression for the world or whatever. So it's a more expanded perspective, and it obviously includes the self, a recognition that I am another, in some of the shamanism or Mayan shamanism, they say in Lakesh, I am another yourself when they meet someone, I'm another you. So like you said, that mirroring aspect of understanding, oh, everyone struggles. Okay, I struggle too. This is my struggle. So you start to look at what your specific struggle is, and you start to notice, is there a level of acceptance? Acceptance is a step that is necessary to develop the compassion for the self and other. I accept that I am not perfect. I accept that the Dalai Lama accepts that he's a human being who could get pushed and pulled in these different directions. So he goes to the simplicity of, I'm a human being. I want to be a better human being. I'm a monk. That's my path and how I become a better human being. And he sticks to that identity. So the identity is recognizing that bludgeoning yourself for doing something wrong, which many of sensitives do, is not helping you be in an expansive, loving place. So looking at yourself with love often happens from the mirror of what someone's done to you, like accepting them. So what I realized you accept with forgiveness is, like, say someone raped you, like, how do you accept that I created a rape in my life, or I created losing all my money, or being swindled, or whatever the things are that hurt us. And I don't think that we're forgiving the action. I think we're forgiving the person for being a flawed human, and that acceptance of that helps with self-acceptance a little further, knowing that we're going to have the push-pulls to be angry, but you didn't act on it. Maybe you felt it in your mind, but you didn't act on it. And then you practice something that would help you move away from acting on it, and you pat yourself on the back for taking those steps. So the compassion can't develop for the self, can't develop alone. We need other people to help us even know that we need to develop compassion for ourselves,
Right, right.
So interactive,
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yes, that's very helpful. And just one last question, because like it's
Yeah, we've been,
time already flies, but it's so fascinating. So I know that you were actually in Dharamsala like recently, and so you met the Dalai Lama. And how did that feel for you after all that story that you've shared? And I mean, this is your life path, right? Like, so connected to him. How was it?
it was really fascinating, because I probably, once I woke up and realized who he was, so I can't remember when that was, 2000 or something, 99 or 2000, I went to a teaching every year, whether it was in the United States, in New York, or in Pennsylvania, or in California, then in Europe, and Austria, to many, many places. And so I had taken all these teachers with him, and I had given up the idea of, like, first I just wanted, oh, he's my teacher, I want him to see me and pat me on the head and tell me he's my teacher, like, and it was just trusting internally that, oh, my first disappointment, once I learned who he was, my first disappointment was that he has so many followers, I'm never going to get next to him. Like, I wanted a teacher that I could, like, sit in the ashram in front of and get, a pat on the head or whatever. And so it was just kind of trusting in that. And when I got invited to go to Dharamsala through a series of, synchronicities, it was very exciting. And it was, being there, you just felt him everywhere, and the night before I was going to have my audience, my teacher that I was working with, Geshe-la, he said something about, like, don't ask a lot of questions, meditate on before. And I went into a meditative state for about 5 hours during the night before, where the universe, the energy, all of it was there. And that was so phenomenal. And, I received words and a transmission, and, a greater commitment to being on the path and not feeling I'm old and I'm tired or whatever. And so seeing him in the person was just wonderful, but not quite as powerful as that connection. And that made me realize I've had that connection for 40 years or whatever. We have the ability to connect to spirit in that way, but sometimes we think we need that, parental 3D badge or branding that says, I'm a spiritual being, and the Dalai Lama has, endorsed me.
Yes, wow, I love this. You know what I love about this, Melissa, as well, is because, it shows how accessible it is to anyone. Like, spirituality and the connection with the spiritual world is something anyone can, connect with. It's not even have, right? It's like it can live through. And what a but there's no, I mean, what a great answer is what I want to say, because you're right. Like sometimes it's not about where to go, who you're with, like it's that connection, and you felt it even with or without his physical presence.
Yeah, I remember my friend said, we may not get to see him if you go all the way to India. And I remember my answer was, doesn't matter, I'll feel him, if I have to sit in the parking lot, I'll feel him. And, that's what was reiterated all those different years of wanting to see him or touch him or, have a picture of me with him or whatever. And now I do have a picture of me with him, as an old lady. It's very, spirit is always there, and
Yeah.
it's developing that trust, and that's what the practice and the path helps us get to, the places where we are judging ourselves, judging others, the places where we are losing hope and not feeling the connection because we're looking around our world and not seeing the changes we want to see. So expectation is another whole story that we can talk about sometime.
Yes, definitely. I feel like each time we talk, like there's so many like podcast ideas coming up because the topic is so vast. And well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing like what you share, like how fascinating, like the story is. And also thank you for sharing like every month actually through your channeling of the full moon, like the wisdom of Quan Yin, therefore the Dalai Lama. I mean, for me, I've never been to Dharamsala. I've never had like such a deep, like connection with him, but I feel like I did connect with him in a way actually through the full moon channeling that I've been, really connecting with for all those years. So that's the gift you bring to all of us. And really thank you for that.
Well, may I say that your connection to Kuan Yin has been really deep through the flowers and through the person that connected us, who is someone who works with the flowers as you did. And, her
True.
gift that she started speaking to us, that she brought to humanity back, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, was she called it the gift of the garden, and so many messages about the flowers. So I think the truth is that, nature, again, if we really go back to the earth, people will start to soften up and feel those connections. They'll start to come in like they started to come in for me. And then you have to sort of like integrate it all. It's like getting a new food, and you have
Yeah,
to integrate it.
exactly. But
Yeah.
then once you taste that food,
Yeah.
you don't want to go back.
True. And that's something like, so his talk about being simple is what keeps him on the path, being simply connected to his renunciation, his monkism, wrong word, but his,
Mhm.
and so we have to find the thing that does bring us peace, and all of us know what does and what doesn't. Anyway,
True.
cool.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you. And the next full moon gathering is next week. Next week, 1 week
Yeah,
from now.
May has two. So the
Oh,
1st of May
interesting.
and the 30th of May, I think. So it's a blue moon month. So wow.
Oh, exciting.
Yeah, very.
Thank you, dear Melissa. Thank you.
Yeah. Blessings.